Jessica's life was one of routine. Married to her college sweetheart, David, for 8 years, she thought she had everything figured out. Their relationship was steady, predictable, and maybe a little too comfortable. They loved each other, of course, but the spark that once defined their connection had dulled over the years. Her days revolved around her corporate job at an advertising agency. She'd long since grown accustomed to the long hours, the creative deadlines, and the occasional office drama. But nothing in her predictable world could have prepared her for the arrival of Kyle. Kyle joined the agency as a new marketing strategist. From the moment he walked into the office, his presence commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with an easy confidence, he seemed to light up the room wherever he went. His fitted dress shirts hinted at a muscular physique, and his friendly demeanor made him an instant favorite among the staff. Jessica noticed him immediately, though she tried not to stare. During his introductory meeting, Kyle's deep voice and quick wit made an impression on everyone. She'd seen attractive coworkers come and go before, but something about Kyle was different. He had a magnetism that was hard to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Jessica found herself crossing paths with Kyle more often than seemed coincidental. He'd stop by her desk with questions about ongoing campaigns or linger in the break room when she was there. Their conversation started innocently enough: work-related banter, shared jokes, and casual remarks about their favorite coffee brands. But as the days passed, the tone began to shift. "You've been here for a while, right?" Kyle asked one afternoon as they stood by the coffee machine. Jessica nodded. "Almost a decade. This place feels like a second home at this point." Kyle smiled. "Must be nice to be so established. I'm still finding my footing here. Good thing there are people like you to show me the ropes." His compliment caught her off guard. Jessica laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's nothing, really. You're doing great so far." Their eyes met briefly, and Jessica felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. It was exciting, and dangerous. The turning point came during a late-night brainstorming session. Their team had a looming deadline, and everyone else had left for the evening. Jessica and Kyle stayed behind to finalize the pitch deck. The office was eerily quiet, the hum of computers and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights the only sounds. "Thanks for sticking around," Jessica said as she clicked through slides on her laptop. "I know this isn't exactly how you'd want to spend your night." "It's no problem," Kyle replied, leaning against the table. "I'm used to late nights. Besides, I don't mind the company." Jessica glanced up at him, and the intensity in his gaze made her pulse quicken. She felt her cheeks flush and quickly looked back at her screen, pretending to focus on the presentation. But she couldn't ignore the tension that had settled between them. As the evening wore on, their conversation drifted away from work. Kyle shared stories about his travels and his passion for fitness, while Jessica talked about her early days at the agency. They laughed more than they should have, their voices echoing in the empty office. At one point, Kyle reached over to grab a pen, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was brief but electric. Jessica's breath caught, and when she looked up, Kyle was watching her with a look that left no room for misinterpretation. "Jessica," he said softly, his voice lowering. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I feel like there's something here. Between us." Jessica's heart raced. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she stood abruptly, gathering her things. "We should call it a night," she said, her voice shaky. Kyle didn't press her. "Of course," he said, stepping back. "Good night, Jessica." As she drove home that night, Jessica's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew she should nip this in the bud, set boundaries, and refocus on her marriage. But part of her couldn't forget the way Kyle made her feel, seen, desired, and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The next day, Jessica tried to avoid Kyle. She buried herself in work, declined invitations to join the team for lunch, and left the office promptly at 5. But Kyle wasn't deterred. That afternoon, he caught her alone in the pantry. "Hey," he said, closing the door behind him. "We should talk." Jessica's pulse quickened. There's nothing to talk about, she said, not meeting his gaze. I think there is, Kyle said, stepping closer. I know you feel it too, Jessica. This connection between us. It's not just in my head. Jessica backed against the counter, her breathing unsteady. Kyle, we can't, this isn't right. He reached out, his hand grazing hers. Sometimes, the right thing and the thing we want aren't the same. I'm not saying this is easy, but it's real. I can feel it. Can't you? Jessica's resolve wavered as she looked into his eyes. The tension was palpable, and in that charged moment, the line between right and wrong began to blur. Jessica spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but her mind was a whirlwind. Kyle's words played on repeat, filling her with equal parts guilt and exhilaration. She knew this was dangerous territory. She loved her husband David, but their relationship had become stagnant. Kyle's attention made her feel desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. That evening, as she drove home, Jessica's phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. I'm sorry if I made things awkward today. I didn't mean to push you. I just couldn't keep pretending like I didn't feel something for you. Jessica's heart raced as she read the message. She typed a response and deleted it 3 times before settling on. It's okay. I just need some time to process this. His reply came almost instantly. Take all the time you need. Just know I'm here if you want to talk. Over the next few days, Jessica tried to avoid Kyle, but their interactions were unavoidable. Every meeting, every passing moment in the hallway felt charged. The air between them crackled with unspoken words and lingering glances. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was late, and the office was nearly empty. Jessica had stayed behind to finish a client proposal, and Kyle was there working on another project. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Still here? He asked, leaning against the doorframe of her office. Jessica forced a smile. Yeah. Just wrapping up a few things. Mind if I join you? He asked, holding up his coffee mug. I could use a break. Jessica hesitated but nodded. Sure. Why not? Kyle stepped into the room, and they talked about work at first, but the conversation quickly shifted. He asked about her life outside the office, her dreams, and her frustrations. Jessica found herself opening up in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. She told him about her struggles to reignite the spark in her marriage and her feelings of being taken for granted. You deserve to feel appreciated, Kyle said, his voice soft. You're incredible, Jessica. Anyone can see that. The sincerity in his eyes was disarming. Jessica's defenses crumbled, and before she knew it, they were leaning toward each other. Their lips met in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened. For a moment, Jessica forgot about everything else, her marriage, her guilt, the potential consequences. The sound of a door closing down the hall snapped her back to reality. Jessica pulled away abruptly, her face flushed. I can't do this, she said, standing and gathering her things. This was a mistake. Jessica, wait, Kyle said, his tone pleading. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. It's not you. It's me. I have to go. Jessica left the office, her heart pounding as she drove home. The kiss had awakened something inside her, but it also filled her with shame. She avoided Kyle for the next few days, throwing herself into work and trying to convince herself that nothing had changed. But Kyle wasn't willing to let things go so easily. He cornered her in the break room one afternoon, his expression earnest. We need to talk, he said. Jessica glanced around nervously. The office was bustling, and she didn't want to draw attention. Not here, she whispered. Then where? Kyle pressed. Because I can't keep pretending like that kiss didn't happen. Against her better judgment, Jessica agreed to meet him after work. They found a quiet cafe away from the office, where they could talk without fear of being overheard. I'm sorry for how I've been acting, Jessica began, stirring her coffee. This isn't me. I don't do things like this. I know, Kyle said. But there's something between us, Jessica. You can feel it too, can't you? She looked away, unable to deny the truth. It doesn't matter. I'm married. Kyle reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. But are you happy? Jessica's silence spoke volumes. That night, Jessica went home to David, who was sitting on the couch watching TV. He barely looked up as she walked in, mumbling a quick, "Hey," before returning his attention to the screen. The contrast between David's indifference and Kyle's intensity was stark, and it left Jessica feeling more conflicted than ever. Unable to sleep, she found herself replaying the events of the past few weeks. Kyle's words, his touch, and the way he looked at her all haunted her thoughts. She knew she was at a crossroads. One path led back to the life she'd built with David, safe but unremarkable. The other was uncharted territory, filled with risk but also the possibility of something more. Jessica didn't know which road she'd take, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same. Jessica's inner turmoil grew with each passing day. She tried to focus on her marriage, pouring effort into spending time with David, cooking his favorite meals, and even suggesting a weekend getaway. But David's detached responses only deepened the void she felt. At the same time, Kyle's presence at work remained impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Jessica's heart sank when her manager, Claire, announced a new initiative requiring team members to pair up for client pitches. "Jessica, you and Kyle will take the lead on the Langston account," Claire said, oblivious to the tension between them. "You two have complementary strengths. I'm confident you'll crush it." Jessica's stomach churned as Kyle flashed her a small, knowing smile from across the room. After the meeting, he caught up with her at her desk. "Looks like we'll be spending a lot of time together," he said, his tone light but tinged with something deeper. Jessica forced a polite smile. "Yeah, I guess so. Let's keep it professional." "Always," Kyle replied, though his gaze lingered a moment too long. Their first planning session was scheduled for late in the afternoon, long after most of the team had left for the day. Jessica insisted on meeting in a conference room, hoping the sterile environment would keep things strictly business. But the atmosphere crackled with unspoken tension. "So, what's our angle for Langston?" Jessica asked, flipping through a notebook. "They're looking for innovative branding, right?" Kyle nodded, leaning forward. "We could focus on sustainability. That's big in their industry right now." Jessica jotted down his idea, grateful for the distraction of work. But as they brainstormed, she couldn't help but notice how close he'd moved, how his cologne lingered in the air. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same pen, and the electricity between them was undeniable. "Kyle," Jessica said, her voice firm. "We can't keep doing this." Kyle met her gaze. "Doing what?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "Whatever this is. I can't let it jeopardize my marriage or my career." Kyle leaned back, his expression softening. "I get it, Jessica. I don't want to make things harder for you. But I can't pretend I don't care about you. I'll back off if that's what you want, but you need to be honest with yourself about how you feel." Jessica's resolve wavered, but she stayed silent. Kyle sighed, gathering his things. "Let's call it a night," he said. "We'll pick this up tomorrow." The next day, Jessica tried to focus solely on the Langston pitch, but fate had other plans. During lunch, she overheard two coworkers gossiping near the break room. "Have you noticed how close Jessica and Kyle have gotten?" one of them whispered. "Totally. They're always working late together." "It's suspicious," the other replied with a chuckle. Jessica's face burned as she quickly retreated, her heart pounding. She hadn't realized how obvious their interactions had become. Panic set in. If people were already talking, how long before it reached Claire's ears? Or worse, David's? That evening, Jessica's nerves were on edge when she returned home. David greeted her with the usual indifference, barely looking up from his laptop as she walked in. "Hey," he mumbled. Jessica hesitated, then sat beside him. "David, can we talk?" He glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "About what?" "Us," she said. "I feel like we've been distant lately." I miss how things used to be. David sighed, setting his laptop aside. Jess, I've been stressed with work. You know that. It's not personal. But it feels personal, she admitted. I need to feel like we're a team, like we're in this together. David frowned. What do you want me to say? That I'll magically have more energy after 14-hour days? I'm doing the best I can. Jessica's heart sank. I'm not asking for magic, David. Just effort. The conversation ended with no resolution, leaving Jessica more conflicted than ever. That night, she lay awake, torn between her loyalty to her marriage and the undeniable pull she felt toward Kyle. The next day at work, Kyle was waiting for her by her desk. Can we talk? He asked quietly. Jessica hesitated but nodded, following him to the pantry. Once inside, Kyle closed the door, his expression serious. I meant what I said before, he began. I'll back off if that's what you want. But you need to tell me, Jessica. Do you want me to? Jessica's chest tightened. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could speak, the door opened abruptly, and Claire walked in, stopping short when she saw them. Oh, Claire said, her eyes narrowing. Am I interrupting something? Jessica's heart raced. No, she said quickly. We were just discussing the Langston account. Claire didn't look convinced but nodded. All right. Well, don't let me stop you. As Claire left, Jessica turned to Kyle, panic in her eyes. This has to stop, she whispered. Kyle nodded solemnly. I understand. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. Jessica avoided Kyle for the rest of the week, throwing herself into the Langston account with single-minded determination. She worked late, came in early, and avoided conversations that veered toward anything personal. But despite her best efforts, the tension between them lingered, unspoken and unresolved. At home, things with David didn't improve. Jessica's attempts to rekindle their connection were met with indifference, or excuses. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to spark a meaningful conversation, Jessica found herself sitting in her car in the driveway, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Her thoughts drifted to Kyle, his intensity, his attentiveness, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. A ping from her phone broke her reverie. It was a text from Kyle. I miss talking to you. Can we at least clear the air? Jessica's fingers hovered over the screen. She knew responding would only complicate things further, but the pull was too strong. Meet me at the cafe after work tomorrow. We need to talk. The next evening, Jessica arrived at the cafe early, nervously stirring her coffee as she waited for Kyle. When he walked in, his eyes immediately found hers. He smiled, a mix of relief and something deeper etched across his face. Thanks for meeting me, he said, sitting across from her. I hate how things have been left between us. Jessica sighed. Kyle, this has all gotten out of hand. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. You're human, Kyle said gently. You're allowed to feel confused, to want more than what you have. But I also know this isn't easy for you. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But the truth is, I've felt invisible for so long. And you make me feel seen. Kyle reached across the table, taking her hand in his. You deserve to be happy, Jessica. Whatever that looks like, you deserve it. Their conversation was interrupted when Jessica's phone buzzed. It was David. Where are you? Thought you'd be home by now. Guilt surged through her as she quickly typed back a response. Working late. Be home soon. Kyle noticed her expression and withdrew his hand. I don't want to be the reason your life gets harder, he said. If this is too much, tell me, and I'll back off for good. Jessica hesitated, torn between the safety of her marriage and the undeniable pull she felt toward Kyle. Finally, she whispered, I don't know what I want. But I need time to figure it out. Kyle nodded. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Over the next week, Jessica's world began to unravel. Her coworkers' whispers grew louder, and Claire's scrutinizing glances became more frequent. At home, David's indifference gave way to suspicion. One evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, he finally spoke. "Is there something going on with you?" he asked, his tone sharper than usual. Jessica froze. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant," David said. "And working late all the time. I can't help but feel like you're hiding something." Jessica's heart pounded. "I've just been busy with the Langston account. That's all." David didn't look convinced, but he let the matter drop, for now. The breaking point came during a company happy hour. Claire had organized the event to celebrate the team's progress on the Langston pitch. Jessica reluctantly attended, knowing her absence would raise questions. She tried to keep her distance from Kyle, but their connection was impossible to ignore. At one point, Jessica stepped outside for fresh air, and Kyle followed. They stood on the patio, the city lights twinkling around them. "Jessica," Kyle said softly, "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way about you." Before she could respond, the door behind them opened. Jessica's stomach dropped as Claire stepped outside, her expression unreadable. "Am I interrupting?" Claire asked, her tone pointed. Jessica's face flushed. "We were just talking." Claire's gaze lingered on them for a moment before she nodded. "Let's keep it professional, shall we? We've worked too hard on Langston to let anything derail it." As Claire went back inside, Jessica turned to Kyle, panic in her eyes. "This is a mess. I can't keep doing this." Kyle's expression softened. "Then let's figure it out. Together." Jessica knew she had to make a choice. But no matter what she decided, someone would get hurt.